Javier Milei was elected president of Argentina just 1 year ago. How has the country's economy transformed during this period? Let's see. It marks 1 year since Javier Milei's victory in the second round of the Argentine presidential elections, a moment from which he became president-elect of the country, even though he would assume office and the responsibilities it entails on December 10th. And in this past year, Argentina has changed in a very radical way. Let's start with the data that has clearly improved over the past year. First and foremost, quite notably, the inflation data. In November of 2023, the last full month of the Peronist government, the monthly inflation rate reached 12.8%. 1 year later, in October 2024, that inflation rate dropped to 2.7%. And the prevailing expectation in the market right now is that it will continue to decrease over the coming months until it approaches 1% to 1.5% monthly. The second macroeconomic variable that has changed very decisively is the exchange rate gap. A year ago, the exchange rate gap, the difference between the official exchange rate and the parallel exchange rate, was 200%. That is, the price at which dollars were bought in the parallel market was 3 times higher than what was bought in the official market, at the price at which the central bank sold them, since it did not have enough dollars to meet all the demand for dollars at that ultra-reduced price. It had to ration them, arbitrarily limiting, consequently, who could access the dollars and who could not, to import some things and not import others. Well, a year later, that exchange rate gap has reduced to approximately 10%. 10%. From 200% down to 10%, and taking into account that there is a tax, the Impuesto País, which taxes the purchase of dollars in the official market from the central bank at a tax rate of 7.5%. Actually, the exchange rate gap is currently just 2%, which is practically nothing. The exchange rate gap has disappeared. It has vanished over the past year. Thirdly, another figure that has also improved significantly is the gross dollar reserves of the central bank. A year ago, as we said, the gross reserves were plummeting despite the increase in short-term dollar debt by the central bank, because the exchange rate at which the central bank sold those dollars was so far from reality. The exchange gap was so huge that it was running out of reserves. That is why the gross reserves fell to $20 billion, and the net reserves took on a negative value of negative $13 billion. The difference between the gross reserves and the short-term dollar debt of the central bank. Well, 1 year later, gross reserves exceed $30 billion, and net reserves are still negative but have been reduced to less than half. In fourth place, a year ago, the strictly budgetary public deficit, the fiscal public deficit, not taking into account the quasi-fiscal, stood in Argentina at 3.1% of the gross domestic product. In fact, it closed the year, completed the total of 2023 at 4.4% of the gross domestic product. Well, as of today, the budget balance of the Argentine National Administration is in surplus by 0.5% of the GDP. Therefore, it went from a deficit of 3% of the GDP in November, which ended up being 4.5% of the GDP in December, to what is expected to ultimately be a surplus of around 0.5% of the GDP, a fiscal adjustment of 5 percentage points of gross domestic product in just 1 year. Fifthly, a year ago, the quasi-fiscal public deficit, the amount of new pesos that the central bank had to create to pay the interest on its remunerated liabilities, the quasi-fiscal public deficit was around 10% of the Argentine GDP. The remunerated liabilities of the central bank amounted to around $30 billion, approximately 5% of the Argentine GDP, and were paid at a monthly interest rate of more than 11%. Over the course of a year, this meant paying interest on that sum of around $60 billion, which is approximately 10% of Argentina's GDP. Well, currently, 1 year later, Not only have the interest rates of the Central Bank of the Argentine Republic been reduced from 11% to 3%, without causing a flight from the peso and, therefore, a depreciation of the peso. On the contrary, the peso is appreciating. Not only that, but all remunerated liabilities of the central bank have been transferred to the Treasury in such a way that the old quasi-fiscal deficit of the central bank is now borne by the Treasury. And with the Treasury assuming it, we can say that this quasi-fiscal public deficit has been reduced to approximately 2% of the GDP. Therefore, here we are also talking about an adjustment of 8 percentage points of the GDP in the quasi-fiscal deficit, almost 5 points of adjustment in the strictly fiscal deficit, and 8 points in the quasi-fiscal deficit. We are talking about an adjustment throughout the year to enhance the solvency of the Argentine public administrations by around 13 points of gross domestic product. And because of this, in 6th place, Argentina's risk premium, the Riesgo País, has plummeted in the past year. A year ago, Argentina's country risk exceeded 2,700 basis points. Currently, it has fallen below 750 basis points. That is, a reduction of 2,000 basis points. 20 percentage points in interest rates that the Argentine state saves on its debt as a result of having improved through the reduction of the fiscal deficit and the quasi-fiscal deficit. The solvency of the Argentine state. In 7th place, the reduction of the risk premium, the country risk of the state, and more generally, of the Argentine economy, is also boosting an increase in the provision of dollar financing for the Argentine private sector. A year ago, loans in US dollars to the Argentine economy barely reached $3.7 billion. 1 year later, this figure has increased to $8.5 billion. In other words, it has multiplied by 2.3 times in just 1 year. And this rapid increase in financing that the Argentine private sector is receiving should also lead us to be optimistic about 2 macroeconomic indicators that seemingly have worsened over the past year. And I say seemingly because they are 2 macroeconomic indicators, quite delayed. If we look at all the previously mentioned data that have shown a very good profile, I have compared the latest available data, which used to be from September or October 2024 versus November 2023. However, in the following 2 data points, which are usually mentioned as negative in Milei's administration, we actually only have official data up until June of the year 2024. Therefore, we are disregarding the 4 months that have passed since then. And to which 2 negative data points am I referring? Well, firstly, to the evolution of the gross domestic product. In quarter-on-quarter terms, the GDP for the first quarter of 2024 decreased by 2.2% and then fell by 1.7% in the second quarter of 2024. Now then, let's not lose sight of the fact, which many people forget to mention, that the Argentine GDP was already declining, and even more sharply. That in these last 2 cases I have mentioned, in the 4th quarter of 2023, a quarter that, in its entirety, was predominantly under Peronism. Therefore, the Argentine economy already had very serious problems. It was already in contraction, and that contraction has continued at least until the first half of 2024. What happens? Based on other leading activity indicators that we already have, it seems that the Argentine GDP has already started to grow again in the 3rd quarter of 2024. JP Morgan even mentions quarter-over-quarter growth above 2%, something that, in part, would be consistent with the evolution of credit to the private sector that we have seen previously. And, on the other hand, it is also often mentioned as a very negative aspect of Javier Milei's first year that the poverty rate has skyrocketed compared to the Peronist period. However, let us keep in mind not only that if the poverty rate surges, it is as a result of the essential adjustment in public finances that Javier Milei must undertake to restore the solvency of the Argentine state, which had been so deteriorated by Peronism. Let us also keep in mind that according to preliminary indicators of poverty, it has already begun to decline since the month of June of this year 2024. Therefore, it also seems that the trend in poverty is moving in the right direction. That is, towards having fewer poor people. In short, the first year of Javier Milei's government is characterized by macroeconomic stabilization, by bringing order to the financial situation of the Argentine state, a necessary though not sufficient condition for the Argentine economy to grow healthily again, improving the well-being of the entire population. During the pandemic, during this first year of Javier Milei's government, the country has taken a very significant step forward to recover the prosperity that Peronism had taken from them. And what remains in the coming years is to continue taking the next decisive steps